And welcome to Longwood's leadership discussion. For those of you who I don't know, I am Matthew Hart, CEO for Longwoods. I would also like to thank Pfizer Canada, who is providing an education grant for today, and without their support, we would not be able to bring this event to you. So that's about it for me. I would now like to hand it over to the new Vice President for Public Affairs, Communications, and Stakeholder Relations for St. Joseph's Healthcare in Hamilton, Carly Weeks. Carly, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Matt. Yes, and for those who aren't aware or who may not even know who I am, I have been a long-time journalist with the Globe and Mail. I've spent the past 2 decades working in journalism at outlets across Canada, the vast majority spent with the Globe and Mail covering health. So it's kind of that context that Matt asked me to join this discussion today. And I'm in a transition to my new role, which will be also in health at a hospital. So I'm very excited to lead this discussion and introduce the panelists in just a short moment. We're in a really exciting place, internationally and in Canada when it comes to gene therapy, innovative development, and all kinds of really important things happening. And so that's a lot of what we're going to be discussing today. So yeah, as Matt mentioned, please get your please have some questions ready, and we'll get going. So without further ado, I thought I would introduce the panelists, starting with David Page, who is a consultant of safety and supply of coagulation products with the Canadian Hemophilia Society. We're also going to be joined today by Graham Statt, the CAO at the District of Summerland, and who's also a pharmaceutical consultant and former assistant deputy health minister with the province of Alberta. Dr. Jerry Teitel, medical director of the Hemophilia Treatment Program at St. Michael's Hospital, and Durhane Wong-Rieger, president and CEO of the Canadian Organization for Rare Disorders. So thanks everyone for being here today. And before we get into the panel questions, I'm going to just start by asking each of you to provide a brief overview of the topic from your vantage point and your perspective. So we're going to start the discussion with Jerry.
Thank you, Carly. So gene therapy for hemophilia became theoretically feasible in the early 1980s when the genes for factor VIII and factor IX were identified. At the same time, an entire generation of hemophiliacs was being devastated by iatrogenic infection with HIV and hepatitis C. Therefore, the prospect of a phenotypic cure with gene therapy held the promise of freeing hemophilia patients from their dependence on the blood products that had poisoned so many of them. For other reasons, hemophilia A and B were identified as ideal disease models for clinical trials in gene therapy. They were caused by pathogenic variants in single genes, causing deficiency of a plasma protein. Even minor expression of transgene protein would have major clinical benefit, and there was a very wide margin of safety for overexpression. We've now seen several successful clinical trials and 3 licensed products already on the market for hemophilia, all of them using hepatocyte-directed AAV-derived vectors delivering modified factor VIII and factor IX gene constructs. However, while all this work was going on, other protein-based therapies were developed that we didn't foresee when we became fixated on the promise of gene therapy. Current replacement therapies, including extended half-life concentrates, have excellent records of efficacy and safety. We now also have non-replacement treatments for hemophilia A patients that provide effective prophylaxis with infrequent subcutaneous injections, and similar products for hemophilia B that are very close to clinical availability. So we can now offer our hemophilia patients publicly funded treatment regimens that are much less onerous to administer and that allow them to enjoy near normal quality of life and life expectancy. So as we have an expanding selection of safe, effective, and convenient treatment options, such that hemophilia is no longer a fatal or even necessarily a debilitating disease, it's fair to ask, what added benefit will gene therapy bring to our patients? Does it address important unmet needs? Well, I believe it does. Short of liver transplantation, gene therapy is the only intervention that can provide long-term and perhaps even lifelong correction of the hemophilia phenotype without the need for repeated intravenous or subcutaneous injections. At its most successful, gene therapy can be tantamount to cure, freeing patients with severe hemophilia from the need for specialized care and costly maintenance therapies and freeing up resources that can be redeployed to other areas of medical need.
Thank you so much for that. David, we'll go to you next.
Thanks, Carly, for the opportunity to present the patient perspective in this webinar. I have severe hemophilia B, and I'm 72 years old and living with the long-term joint damage that comes with repeated hemorrhages into ankles, knees, and elbows since I was a baby. Gene therapy for hemophilia B is a reality, as Jerry said. 2 different gene therapies using AAV vectors were approved by Health Canada in 2023 for adults with severe hemophilia B, and both were recommended for reimbursement by Canada's drug agency in the last few months, conditional on pricing negotiations and system readiness. Unfortunately, one of those therapies was rejected by ENEFS in an announcement just this morning. I myself have not received gene therapy, though I'm definitely interested. I've followed the research very closely and have spoken to a number of people who have received gene therapy in clinical trials, and outcomes have been extremely positive. Professionally, I work for the Canadian Hemophilia Society, a patient organization, and in the last year, given that gene therapy may soon be accessible here, and that it is a life-changing treatment decision requiring rigorous shared decision-making, I have led the creation of a gene therapy education program for patients and caregivers, which includes booklets, podcasts, and webinars. Our patient group works very closely with the healthcare providers in hemophilia across Canada in education and access issues. I have followed the gene therapy access discussions and negotiations around the world, and based on my reading of the research in terms of the durability of hemophilia gene therapy and our understanding of the current costs here in Canada, I'm convinced that not only would this treatment be of great benefit to patients, but also that it would be cost saving within approximately 10 years. It should be seen as an investment and not a cost. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Durhane.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much for the opportunities to speak here, and really appreciate Longwoods and Carly for setting this up. For me, I would like to speak a little bit more broadly, I think, with regard to cell and gene therapies, because right now, as David and Jerry is indicating, we've got applications for gene therapies for hemophilia A and B, but actually this is going to be the 3rd set of gene therapies into Canada. We've got 2 approved gene therapies already, both of which have actually been funded, or at least put into the funding reimbursement. The first for spinal muscular atrophy, which some will know is a really debilitating rare disease, and can lead to certainly early death for patients with a severe form of it. That gene therapy has been available for, I think, almost 2.5, 3 years now. And then also a gene therapy for called Luxturna for a form of blindness, which again can affect adolescents, but also adults, and life-changing, I think, as both David and Jerry have indicated. A little bit different in terms of, how they came into the market and kind of what the implications have been. But I think SMA is a really good example for us to talk about based on what you've already heard, and that is, what is the value of it? Started off with the first therapy for SMA was, in fact, an intrathecal infusion, Spinraza. And it really did slow down the progression, certainly saved the lives of those babies that had very severe forms of it, but required lifelong intrathecal infusions. When Zolgensma came in, it was in fact a gene therapy that would provide the same benefits, and in fact, if very early administered, could actually prevent debilitating physical disability. So again, a life-changing, and certainly at this point, what we think is a permanent change. So the challenges, I think, for the healthcare system is, how do we make these available? And quite frankly, we saw huge problems when we had brought both of these in, because our system is not set up to actually fund and invest in, as David and Jerry talked about it. This is not paying for, this is not reimbursement. It is an investment in terms of long-term healthcare benefits, but also long-term cost-effective therapies. SMA got kind of lucky because we had a therapy already that was very expensive. and it had to be given, every other month for children, and very painfully so. And so when the gene therapy came in, if you extrapolated the cost of it to 5 years, it would actually not only pay for the infusions, but you would have children who, if you got it early, would have no disabilities and actually be able to live, fairly normal childhood. So it made it very cost effective. A little bit more challenge for the treatment for, retinopathy, because there really wasn't a comparative therapy. And so you were bringing it in de novo, and this became a real problem because our healthcare system really uses this kind of comparative funding in order to make it available. We need to change. Obviously, right now, with the $1.5 billion that Health Canada or the federal government has made available for a rare disease drug strategy, we're begging them to not just invest in paying for a drug, because you can use up $1.5 billion in a heartbeat. What we want to do is invest into the system to make sure that we're able to properly diagnose, manage, and follow patients, and to actually provide these therapies early on to patients, track and follow them, and if there's demonstrated to be a benefit, then it comes back into the healthcare system, because as both David and Jerry says, long term, we know that there is, in fact, not only a benefit to the patients, but actual return on the investment, cost savings to the healthcare system. What we need to do is get the monies up front to be able to invest in these, and our system is not well set up to do this, and we need them to use this opportunity of having this $1.4 billion as that bolus to be able to start patients and to invest in not just the gene therapies, but many other therapies that could look like they're expensive to begin with, but will take them many years to actually demonstrate the efficiencies and the effectiveness.
Thank you so much for that helpful overview. Graham.
Yeah, well, I'll bring some payer perspective here, I guess, and also reflecting on my time as vice chair of the Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance. So I guess I'd just say, there's 7,000 known rare diseases worldwide, and about 80% of those are actually genetic in origin. In fact, through research and discovery, we could get to the place where we find out most people have some form of genetic disease. The government really does need to be pragmatic in making our decisions, and we'll probably focus on, severity of that disease and the unmet need. Sure, some of these treatments can be a single dose solution, and the patient populations can be small, but at the same time, that single dose could cost millions of dollars, and the therapy might not actually have comprehensive clinical data yet in order to make those decisions. So already we're seeing provinces spending north of 40% of their healthcare budgets, or of their budgets rather, on healthcare. And in fact, the drug file is the most highest and fastest growing cost pressure in those healthcare budgets. So the thing I'd also mention, and it's sort of along the same lines as Durhane bringing up her comments, these special medicines also require health system supports as well that do go beyond those drug budgets. And even at the same time, if genetic medicines live up to the expectations, they can absolutely create savings and result in less visits to the emergency ward, less requirements for complex care, and reduce management of episodic issues for years to come, which does save money for the healthcare system. So the benefits and costs of these medicines can be huge when it comes to genetic medicine, which brings us really to finding ways to capture the full value. And often this necessitates the use of innovative agreements for reimbursement, which themselves can be structured, share risk between government and innovators, and perhaps incorporate real-world evidence into the mix as well. But all this does translate into, I'd say, a really big system shift. Because the drug approval process in Canada as it exists today was really developed around more conventional medicines and frankly more conventional ways of paying for those medicines. Now what's exciting right now is we are starting to see the shift happen with Health Canada, the Canadian Drug Agency, and the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance making real-time changes to respond to this big wave of innovation. Health Canada is providing notice of compliance with conditions for certain medicines, And the drug agency can provide time-limited recommendations where the clinical trials are underway, but maybe not done yet. And even the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance is setting up a temporary access process. Now, these are super encouraging developments, I think, for everyone involved in this space, and they'll absolutely give new hope to those who otherwise would face significant delays in seeing the therapies listed in Canada. Plus, the earlier they are identified and treated, the more hope there is for patients to avoid serious complications for disease progression later. So those expedited processes really can't be overstated in terms of their importance for those who are struggling with genetic disease and really waiting for those breakthrough medicines. Now, not to put too much of a cloud over this, but what we're seeing right now is examples where the breakthrough medicines are getting to listing as fast as possible with all these improved processes. But then they're encountering system headwinds that can prevent patient access for up to a year or more. So to me, really the next frontier is going to be that system readiness for the delivery of these medicines. And the way to overcome that barrier will be through earlier upstream conversations at the front end of the regulatory and review process so that we can be ready when those treatments become listed. And there are positive signs that this is beginning to happen and the right conversations are occurring. And I think with enough lead time, provinces and territories can then make the system investments that we heard about from Durhane in the infrastructure and the health workforce, and perhaps even adjusting existing priorities where they need to make sure these drugs get listed and they actually can be delivered. At the end of the day, I guess just to sum up, I would say, patients, payers, manufacturers, we all want the same thing. We want patients to have timely access to the very best medicines that are safe for them and make a real difference. The question is, how can we actually achieve that goal while maintaining health system sustainability and data-driven decision-making through that process? And then keeping the patient at the center of focus, because at the end of the day, these medicines were developed for them.
Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for kind of giving that overview to help ground the discussion and our points going forward. I'll dive into some of the questions right now, and there's a lot of areas we can go. I wanted to first start with David, who does, represent a really important perspective from the patient's point of view. As someone who's been living, with a rare disease for decades, I'm wondering if you can just reflect on, what the moment we're in kind of means, to yourself, to others, and what some of the concerns are, or the concerns that you have about these many access barriers that we've touched on so far. Feel free to take it away, David.
Well, I think you're asking how would this change my life if this were to become available? Well, I can only talk about my own condition. I would go from a weekly IV infusion to none at all likely for the rest of my life. And those infusions are becoming increasingly difficult as I get older. My factor IX level would be much closer to the normal range, meaning that I would have much better protection against bleeding into my joints. And this would likely halt progression of chronic joint disease, which I have, and probably a decrease in pain. And I guess there'd be some psychological benefits. I'm not sure. I probably have to live it to know what they are, but the psychological benefits of no longer having a severe chronic condition, which you have to really think about every day. And I think that's pretty much the case for people that I've talked to. They have a great psychological benefit after receiving a gene therapy and an end to their bleeding, which is significant.
Just as a quick follow-up to that, I mean, when you think about some of the discussion points that are out there, around cost and the need to really understand that we're talking about a very expensive class of drugs. I wonder if you can just quickly, from that patient's point of view, we were speaking about at the end of the day, how can we fund all of these drugs? What is your kind of answer to that very complex question?
Well, I think it's not that complex. If we look at this particular example, we know that my treatments currently cost about $200,000 a year. And that's going to go on for, the rest of my life, unless there's another solution, and gene therapy would be that solution. So I think there's a way to find a reasonable cost that would be cost effective. research shows that this therapy is likely to last 10 years or more, or likely much more. And so, I think we have data to show that within 6 or 7 years, it would be a zero annual budget impact. And within 10 years, it would actually be cost saving in the long term. So, I think as Graham said, we need to look at some innovative solutions for cost sharing, structure this so that we can make an investment, and it's not going to cost more to the system. We want it to cost less to the system. We know how expensive these products are, these treatments are, and if we can cost less and get better treatment, why not? We just have to be creative.
Thank you so much. Durhane, I'd love for you to add in on that, someone who's kind of represented the patient community as a whole and kind of seen the ebb and flow and, all of the excitement building around gene therapy. We know that there was, as you mentioned, the federal government investing in a rare disease strategy, which is sort of in its initial phases. When you look at some of the developments that are going on in the world and where Canada is at, where would you sort of place us in the international context? And what do you see as some of the key barriers holding back further progress, further access to treatments for patients?
Well, since you asked so nicely, Carly, I'm going to take a very positive slant on this because certainly I think everybody here knows that we could go into the bleak environment of saying, look, Canada is not top on anybody's list in terms of an early market for many of these innovative therapies. But I do think that there is, I think, as Graham indicated, somewhat of a sea change in Canada. I think with the rare disease drug strategy, we've seen huge investment in terms of not just gene therapies, but also investment in terms of research and development for cell therapies. So some of these, treatments that are also life-altering are actually using bone marrow transplants to be able to reprogram the cells in order to provide that kind of life-type treatments. And some of those are actually being pioneered right here in Canada. Some of the gene therapies are actually being developed in many of our research environments here. And I was really privileged to be here at BIO to listen to Life Sciences Ontario present an overall, 2-hour program around what it is that's happening, but not just here, but elsewhere. So I think we are seeing Canada take an attitude of investment in terms of advanced therapies, using not only the capabilities that are in our hospitals, our research environments, to think about how do we contribute to creating these therapies that actually at the end of the day are also going to come back in terms of benefits to Canada. We need to be a little savvy in terms of how do we actually move it into the end. So that's one thing that I am seeing. And as I said, I'm trying to put the best optimism on it because we do know that many of our systems are slow in terms of response. We've seen Health Canada move forward in terms of innovative regulatory processes that allow us to do very small patient populations, even in N-of-1s, where we can develop a therapy for a single patient that actually could benefit that patient in a very novel way. So I do hope that Canada really sees itself as become part of a global solution and taking advantage of these. We have amazing genetics and genomics here. Part of the challenge, hemophilia is kind of easy. Spinal muscular atrophy is kind of easy. We can diagnose these patients. Others, we need to do much more exacting kinds of diagnosis to see who's going to benefit from it. We have tremendous capacity here in Canada for doing that kind of precise diagnosis so that, I think as everybody says, what's the best way of getting a return on investment is to make sure that the patient you're treating is getting the best optimal treatment. And so it isn't just, okay, what kind of genetic mutation do you have? What is the specific mutation you have? What are the specific genomics around it? And which therapy that might work best for you? We're going to see an array of gene therapies coming through that are going to be highly targeted. I think for me, I would love to see us think about this. We've got 3 gene therapies, 4 gene therapies right now. We're going to have, in the next few years, literally hundreds of them. So we need to get our system into shape where we not only can accept these therapies and be able to find a way of actually being able to make them accessible, but also thinking how do we become part of the investment in terms of developing these. Some of the novel ways of being able to make these therapies affordable, I'm part of a consortium at Tufts University. We talk about amortization. As David says, Okay, it's going to pay itself back in a period of 5, 10 years. Fine. You know, many of the European countries, even the life insurance programs in the US, are talking about amortization. Pay me on it's like a mortgage, right? You know, nobody buys $1 million house and pays for it. You get a mortgage, you amortize it. So these are the kind of things that our system can do, and you can even do it on a sort of a return on investment basis. As long as it works for the patients, they're actually demonstrating the benefits of it, you continue to pay. If it doesn't show that this patient's not right, is not working for them, and they have to switch back into some other therapy, you stop paying. And in fact, some of the arrangements allow for you to get a free period up front where you can demonstrate it works. There's lots of, I think, innovative solutions are coming in. I'm really excited, for instance. I do a lot of work internationally. I head up the Rare Disease International, our global alliance of patient organizations. I head up the Asia Pacific Alliance of Rare Disease Organizations. Guess what? Malaysia has actually made newborn screening for SMA part of their benefits. They've actually made Zolgensma a reimbursed therapy. I mean, so if it's cost effective in Malaysia, good gosh, it can be cost effective here. So we're seeing many other countries now moving into this space to say, okay, we see the long-term benefits of this, so we just need to find some creative ways of working with not only our health systems, but with companies. Many of the manufacturers are quite happy to think about how do we come into these innovative funding solutions. So I will say, Carmen, I'm glad you asked the question, but for me, the optimistic point is that we can do this. And I think we need to have the willingness to do it. We need to actually have the creativity to do it. And we also need to put in those other systems that allow us to collect the data over a long-term real world basis to demonstrate it works. Because we don't want to pay for anything that doesn't work. No patient wants to take anything that doesn't work. And we should not be certainly investing our monies into things that we can't demonstrate the benefits of. This is why we keep coming back to the rare disease drug strategy and say, don't just pay for the drugs. Invest in being able to screen, diagnose, get to the right specialist, get real world evidence that it's working.
Thank you so much for that. That's really insightful. Jerry, I wanted to bring you into the discussion and just, as someone like hemophilia and other blood disorders are obviously at the forefront to where a lot of gene therapies are right now, and it kind of offers us a window to where we might get. And I thought it would be really useful to have your clinical sort of bird's eye view of kind of really what this moment means. I mean, how sort of change worthy this is, separating, the real hope and from hype and kind of, providing that context of actually what this means. And then perhaps you can also sort of talk about some of those challenges that you're seeing and how we might be able to overcome them.
Okay, well, first of all, there has been a lot of hype about gene therapy because we've been talking about it for decades, and it's been spoken about as the holy grail, the ultimate cure. We're in the first generation of gene therapy. There will be other generations that will be more successful than this. So we're going to have early adopters who are interested in this form of gene therapy, and despite to get away from the hype, these work. This is not, although clinical trials continue to go on because we're dealing with rare diseases with small numbers of patients in trials, nevertheless, we have products that are approved, and they're approved because they have been shown to be safe and effective. Now, what does it mean to say that they work? David kind of touched on this when he said that if he took gene therapy now, his factor IX level would likely be closer to normal. Well, we don't know what his level would be, but based on the clinical trials, we can say there's an excellent chance that his level would be either in the nearly normal range, or perhaps even in the normal range, perhaps even above the normal range. And in other words, that's phenotypic correction. And furthermore, gene therapy for hemophilia B appears to be very robust. We know from the animal models, for example, that the expression continues essentially unabated for the lifetime of the animal. And we're anticipating that it's going to be basically lifetime therapy with a single upfront injection. And that's pretty dramatic. The results for hemophilia A are equally good in the early phase, but the benefit does seem to drop off with several years. So with the current generation, again, of gene therapy for hemophilia A, the benefit may not be lifelong, but it may be 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20 years. And that's why I think it's important, and Durhane made the very important point, that essentially what we need to look at is some kind of pay-for-performance model. And, I think the challenge really here is that we're not used to paying upfront for a therapy which is either lifelong or for very long. We're used to paying month after month, year after year, for, in the case of hemophilia, these very costly factor concentrates. And when you look at the accrued savings, as David already outlined, he said, well, it will pay for itself in 10 years. That's true, assuming that it works, and most of the time it does work in the sense of freeing the patient from the need for intravenous infusions. Well, we're not used to paying for that up front. And the problem is that the savings come into different cost centers. So when we talk about looking at the savings, you're not only saving the cost of the factor concentrate that the patient doesn't need, you're saving the cost of reconstructive surgery from the joint damage. You're saving the cost of time off work, of people not contributing to the economy of the country, absenteeism from school, caretaker costs, et cetera. So you look at the whole cost, this is, and I reiterate what's already been said, this is cost effective. Now, I said at the outset that there are other therapies that are, in a way, almost equally exciting to gene therapy. I mean, we didn't imagine a few years ago that we would have subcutaneous preventive treatment for hemophilia. And I don't think we're going to see, and I know this from experience running clinical trials, I don't think we're going to see a stampede that all the 3,000 hemophilia patients in Canada are going to say, I want gene therapy now. Many of them will say, I'm satisfied with my current therapy, I'm satisfied with subcutaneous therapy, or I'm even satisfied with my intravenous therapy. So we've got a luxury in a sense for hemophilia, that we have treatments which are accessible and tolerable for many patients. So I think it is added, it's an addition to our armamentarium. The idea, and David again touched on this, of living a life without knowing you have a chronic disease, not waking up every morning and saying, is this the day I'm going to bleed? Is this the day that I need to struggle to insert a needle into my vein to keep myself alive? My experience from patients who I've treated in clinical trials is that the psychological benefit of having a hemophilia-free mind is something that can't be quantitated, but it's substantial, it's real, and it makes an enormous difference to people's lives.
Thank you so much. That was a really great perspective to hear. Graham, I thought that you could perhaps shed some light on, some of those discussions that go on behind closed doors. A lot of this rests on the shoulders sort of policymakers, people in government in those leadership positions, to try and navigate this and understanding that, we're talking about, a lot of money, and at a time when we know our healthcare system is already so stretched and strained. So just wondering if you can offer some insights on what you see as some of the challenges facing policymakers, and how, perhaps some ways that they should or could start to navigate some of these challenges going forward.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question, but I would say, governments everywhere are instruments that are extremely good at preventing risk. They're not really good at embracing risk. And when we get into some of these therapies, we talk about how to fund them, not having the data yet, and this sort of thing. I think it's just a new world for government, and saying, how do we actually wrap our minds around it? How do we maybe share that risk? Sometimes with, innovative agreements, all for the purpose of achieving not only broader long-term public savings because of the promise of those treatments, but also for the benefit of the patients, obviously. So I think it's a system that's doesn't turn on a dime. And in Canada, it's also complex because, of course, as we all know, healthcare is delivered by the provinces. And when we get into some of these complex therapies, it's not going to, traditionally we would have, largely single molecules, developed, very easy to produce, replicate, easy to genericize, fulfilled by your community pharmacist, prescribed by your primary care professional. And in this world, you've got the involvement of specialists, you have specialized diagnostic requirements, delivery requirements, and in some cases, actually setting up centers of excellence in and across the country that are designed to serve patients, not just for that province, but for other provinces. And you might think, well, we have one healthcare in Canada, one healthcare system. No, we don't, actually. We've got a whole bunch of healthcare systems in Canada, and they don't have a tradition of communicating or cooperating super well across boundaries. And this is really forcing a lot of new sort of collaboration, using that center of excellence example. There's these complex reimbursement agreements between provinces when you serve somebody else's citizen from the province that they're coming from. And so there's that expense and that complication. Working through that can be important, and it is with these centers of excellence. But at the same time, it raises questions of health equity. Well, maybe I shouldn't have to leave my province to get that therapy. Maybe my province should be delivered here. So I think on the patient side, there's some, different ideas and maybe discomfort sometimes in sort of what's required or what's necessitated in order to serve these different therapeutic areas. Anyways, all those challenges are also opportunities, and I do, as I mentioned in my notes, think we're working through them, and it's an exciting time to be a part of it.
Thank you so much for that. Just as a quick follow-up, I'd been wanting to speak about the issue of equity and access to some of these exciting new therapies. I know that is, emerging as a significant concern. I'm just wondering if you might be able to provide some thoughts, realizing it's also a huge question, just on how we start to approach issues around equity when we're talking about the fact that we will likely need centers of excellence and it will likely necessitate travel. How do we ensure equity in that kind of an environment, at least in these initial stages?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. And so we're not going to have, corner store delivery on a lot of these therapies. We might not even have delivery in every large city in the country. And so it's, as you say, that's an element of health equity, asking patients and caregivers to maybe travel at sometimes their own expense, stay near treatment centers for what can be a long period of time as they are monitored. So that can be challenging. They already have health issues. Maybe they're the place where they're from. There's other supports there for them. So that could feel like a health equity issue. But it's probably the only way we're really going to be able to deliver these therapies in country. Sometimes we actually do it out of country, but in country, to set these up, you're probably going to be traveling in many cases to one or two or sometimes three different centers across. Now, the other element of health equity, some of these treatments, because they're highly specialized and we all have different genetics, I just give the example of some of the exciting things that are happening in sickle cell right now in genetic editing with CRISPR. Cas9 treatment. But in a lot of those cases, actually, the genetics there are people from sub-Saharan Africa of genetic descent. And so, you have the majority of these people that can, be African-American descent, Black Canadians. And how are we making sure we're serving them well as they be from these racialized sort of communities and already, experiencing what can be health equity issues? And now, does that translate into their treatment as well? Well, they're a small population. Do you make the investment? Well, they're also, 80% of those patients might be from that sub-Saharan, descent. So there's all different elements of this, but I think it's one of those things we just have to take head on and plow into that in order to sort out some of these solutions and find a way forward.
Thank you so much for that. We're going to turn to audience questions in just a minute, but I thought first I would just ask David to weigh in on that patient equity question From your perspective, certainly, just kind of shedding some light on what that does mean, that reality of, say, having to travel, kind of, looking to centers of excellence and some of the limitations that we're going to be faced, or the patients will be faced with in this initial early phase of gene therapy coming online.
Well, Jerry might be able to add to my answer, but I think we have a great network across Canada of centers of excellence in hemophilia, and we fully expect that only a few will be actually administering gene therapy, but patients can then go back to their own provinces and get the follow-up that they need. So I don't think that's, and Jerry can say whether or not he agrees that I think we will be system ready when this comes along. My bigger concern is that these decisions on access will be made province by province, and we'll have yeses in some provinces and no's in other provinces. And this morning we heard Quebec said no to one of the gene therapies when the rest of the Canada said yes. So that's really concerning that you have these differing opinions from two HTA bodies. So my biggest concern is on the provincial decisions, not so much on the care delivery. But Jerry might want to comment on that.
Yeah, please, Jerry, jump in.
Yeah, from the point of view of equity, the delivery of the current model of gene therapy for hemophilia is dead easy. It's an intravenous infusion that lasts a couple of hours. Very rarely are there adverse effects that might, allergic type reactions, very rare. So the actual development, the actual delivery of this generation of gene therapy in hemophilia is dead easy. There is no reason in my opinion, that any hemophilia treatment center, and we have a network of about 25 of them across the country, there is no reason that any center should not be able to do that. Now, there's a lot of work that comes after that, but the patient doesn't need to be even at the center. It involves basically a fairly frequent blood monitoring, which can be done even in the patient home. So, Graham, you picked a difficult example talking about sickle cell, because that involves stem cell collection and ex vivo transduction and bone marrow ablation. That's a much different issue, as it is for a disease like cystic fibrosis, which is a transmembrane protein disorder. But for a secreted protein deficiency like hemophilia, when you're replacing the gene, it really is, I think we've maybe exaggerated the difficulty. Once this gets into the clinic, it's going to be so easy. We're going to say, why were we so concerned about it? That's my optimistic assessment.
Some optimism is always welcome. Thank you so much for sharing that. It's actually really important to keep note of. We're not talking about uniformity when we will look at all of these different diseases, certainly. So there's a number of questions that have come in. We have a couple of themes emerging. So I'll start with the first one. And I'm not sure who'd want to tackle this first, but if someone wants to jump in, just feel free. So what the first question is, looking at the challenges of the infrastructure, the costs, the need for payment mechanisms, the role that potentially private drug insurance could play in access to gene therapies, and if there is some kind of how is there a balance between public and private, and if so, what that looks like. It seems like maybe a Graham question to start. I don't know if anyone else has some thoughts.
Sure, and I'll try to be quick so we can get as many questions as we can. I'd just say there has to be a way. We don't see that yet in terms of joint ventures and collaboration between the private and public really yet. In fact, in some of the really complex and expensive stuff, we're seeing the opposite. In Alberta, I had the Alberta Blue Cross contract, and on the non-group program, any Albertan can access that program on a payment basis for drug coverage. And we saw in some cases companies actually moving their patients to the public side. When we would list a drug, they would offload them onto the public system. So it doesn't feel like a lot of collaboration there, but I think at the same time, the right discussions could happen to say, what does a hot handoff look like? Maybe they get access early and then we pass the torch.
Thank you so much for that. There's a couple of questions that I'll sort of summarize, and reminding everyone, if you have a question, send it in now. We'll try and get to it. But essentially, there's several questions that are asking about innovative payment models. So, why can't governments look at innovative funding models, or risk-based approaches, risk-sharing agreements with industry, innovative payment strategies? So sort of different questions with the same sort of intent, which I think is looking at why can't we be more innovative when it comes to figuring out how to fund these? And does it have to be sort of the existing approach? Or can we look at trying something new and exciting? I don't know if Graham, you want to jump in, or maybe Durhane, and then we can open it up to the other panelists if they have some thoughts to add as well.
So can I just jump in based on what I think Graham said and what you're asking, and also what's happening internationally, right? I mean, internationally, as we know, you think about the US or other countries, Switzerland, Japan, et cetera, where private payment for drugs are quite prevalent. And there have been lots of agreements that have been made with regard to the pharmaceutical companies in terms of how do you amortize these payments. In the US, in fact, where there's the fear that, people move from one insurer to another, what if I start, we need to kind of move on. There's been the ability to have collaborative agreements across insurers so that from the patient point of view, they're working under one agreement regardless of who is the actual payer. So I think that works. And as your questioner is asking, what about these innovative payments? For me, the huge excitement is actually having the rare disease drug strategy. And the idea is that part of it is that it's meant to equalize or make more equitable, right, the access to these therapies. And I think right now, when we're talking about hemophilia and gene therapies for hemophilia, one of the challenges we've got now is that instead of those products being kind of paid for or kind of gotten through the Canadian Blood Services, the way all the other hemophilia treatments are, the proposal is that it will go to, in fact, a province model, which we think is a big step backwards. I mean, we have looked to the CBS and what's been happening there, and CBS with Heme Quebec as well, as that single point of making a decision, negotiating the price, negotiating how it's going to be accessible. It still is administered through the provincial plans, right? But you've got a single point in which you're doing these agreements. And we would really encourage some more enlightenment in terms of even how these hemophilia products are coming. And that becomes a model for how we can do these agreements. We've got the Canadian Blood, the rare disease drug strategy. We're hoping that what you do have is a single contract. You do have the ability to negotiate quickly a single price, even beyond the PCPA. Doesn't mean that the provincial drug plans are not going to be responsible for administering it, but you don't have the challenge you have now where everybody comes into PCPA. We say we all agree. And then through all these letters of intent, etc., you end up with some provinces making it available, some provinces not making it available until much later, some provinces never making it available. Let us think, as we say, we've got a single drug plan. The other exciting thing I'd like to add when you were talking before and listening to Jerry is that on the heels of this Canadian rare disease drug strategy, all of the pediatric centers, hospitals came together. We now have a rare disease network in Canada, which will mimic what has already been put in place by hemophilia, by some of the neuromuscular disorders, so that you will have the ability to have a network. You can have patients that will have not necessarily easy movement from one to the other, but the experts will work together, the centers of excellence work together, the resourcing in terms of that kind of advice will work together, and hopefully over time we will move more and more to what you see in terms of best practice around hemophilia, what the Europeans do. 27 countries work together under European reference networks on rare diseases. We can surely get 10 provinces and 3 territories to kind of work together under that kind of a joint model, and it's the only way that rare diseases will work. It's the only way these advanced therapies are not only going to be made available, but we're going to be able to track them in a way. So I really feel like Canada is on the verge of being able to make this work in terms of the plans. I don't know what to say about the private drug plans. I do know that we have patients that come to us and say, well, I can get this, but it means nobody else in my house will get any access to, drug insurance. We can get this, but we will we will top max out our private drug plan, in the course of 2 years. So I do think we need to have good kind of collaborations, as Graham says, between the public and private plans on behalf of the patients for how do we solve this. Could be that it all defaults to a public plan. I don't know. Maybe that's what PharmaCare is pushing toward. And maybe this is the first set of therapies that will go into that kind of an all public funded program. Maybe that's what happens. I don't know, but definitely we need to look at how do we get all of these plans to work together?
Thank you for that. And given that there were, 3 or 4 questions about this, I thought we'd just spend the last couple of minutes, unless there's other questions that come in, I think just spending a bit more time on that. So Graham, would love to hear some of your thoughts, just a minute or two, on what, the idea of it being innovative when it comes to payment models.
Well, this is where I could say, as a former, and now recovering public payer, I can say, if let's just be honest, if money wasn't an issue, as soon as Health Canada approved something as safe, we would have it marketed and we'd pay for it. So one of the challenges, I think, is, how do we determine the efficacy? When does that data come in, and how do we balance that in agreement? Does government want to enter a world where there is some innovative agreements and we find a way through that? Absolutely. Are there some examples where we've done that? Yes, there are a few. It was clunky. We have to do better. And I think we have people like the IHE in Edmonton, Institute of Health Economics, developing some template models and boilerplates and working with government. I think we'll get there. At the end of the day, those agreements won't be used for everything, but they'll be used for the things they really need to be used for. And I think we just need to win on a few of those, and we'll continue them. So I have more to say, but I won't say it because you said minute or two, and I'm being obedient on that.
Thanks for that. I appreciate it. And I just thought, we're going to be wrapping up in just a moment, but I thought, I don't know if Jerry or David want to speak specifically about payer models, but maybe just, when you look toward the future, so feel free to talk about payer models, but if you just look to the future and what you kind of hope, if you had sort of a wish list of things that you hope, start to happen in the near future to make these drugs and therapies more accessible to patients. Maybe we'll start with Jerry, we can end off with David.
Yeah, so just a quick word, we're not going to stop paying for hemophilia care. We've been doing it for many years. We will continue to do it. So this is easier than a drug or a disease, the kind of things that maybe Durhane was referring to earlier, in which there isn't effective therapy, in which you're talking about new payments. This is not new. We're talking about just changing. Instead of paying for factor concentrates and subcutaneous non-replacement therapy, we're saying, well, let's pay for something different, which has a longer timeline. And if we look at models that are risk sharing, such as we've already heard about today, then I think there is very low risk for the system. And ultimately, we're talking about savings. So this should not be a very difficult sell. I've said that before, and I'll repeat that. I don't think this should be a difficult sell when you look at the big picture.
Thank you. And I'll give the last word to David.
Yeah, I agree with Jerry. It shouldn't be a difficult sell, but we saw this morning from Ines that it is a difficult sell. They can't deal with the uncertainty. They can't project out into the future. They say that we haven't got enough data to fund this. All I can say is, you can't wait a lifetime to see if a therapy is going to last a lifetime, and that's what they're suggesting. We have to wait and wait and wait. Well, can't wait forever.
Thank you so much. With that, I will just, say thank you to everyone for offering your insights and perspectives today. I know from the work that I've done in recent months, there is legitimate, significant excitement around gene therapies and very real, legitimate, significant questions on, how we pay for this and get it into the hands of people, given that it can, change lives. So I think this is a really great discussion we've had today, and we'll hopefully be able to continue these conversations in the years ahead when we talk about all of the new therapies that are coming online. So with that, I will thank everyone for joining the panel today and being part of such a really great discussion.